Hey folks, Roland Martin here, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Just catching up on some reading. It's right after the new year, and the weather's a little cool right now. And I just reflecting upon, some of the old stories. I tell you, every time I tell some of these old stories about my career and what happened, how I got to be a fisherman, uh, people love it. And one of the stories that comes to mind is how. I'm even here right now. Why I'm even alive right now. Probably the most riveting story is the fact that in the military, I was in the military for a while, and I was all set to go to Vietnam, and I had this colonel that kind of saved my life. Let me tell you that story. That's really kind of a cool story. What happened was I've been going to school, and it was all through the 60s, early 60s. I'm an old guy right now. And I'd go through college, and I had some ROTC in college. That's the reserve officer training that they had mandatory in all the state schools back in the 60s and 70s when they had mandatory draft. See, back then when I was going to school, when you turned 18, you had to register for the draft. And so the Army was going to, or somebody was going to draft you into the military. And so unless you, most likely, unless you had some exemption or some marriage or some physical problem, any healthy A1 body is going to get drafted for the most part in the early 60s. That was me. Okay. So knowing that, I'd had this reserve officer training that I had in school. Anyway, I volunteered for the draft. I got out of college and I volunteered for the draft. Well, that sounded like a good thing, a 2-year commitment. Well, here's what happened. I took my boat. After basic training, I went down to Fort Jackson. I had this aluminum boat, kind of similar to my little bass tracker boat now. It had a little 25 horsepower motor on it. Oh, maybe it was I think so. And it was a little 25 horsepower motor. It was a little 18-foot boat. And I parked it behind the barracks. So when I started going to the advanced training, which was actually radio school, I was going to radio school down at Fort Jackson. This was the year that Kennedy was assassinated. Now, this is the year that Kennedy was assassinated. In fact, I was going to radio school that very week that Kennedy was assassinated, and all of a sudden it came on the news that President Kennedy's been shot. And we all just stood around outside the barracks, and the whole post, the whole country, the whole world just stood there in shock for a whole day. Nothing happened. It was the biggest moment, the biggest shock of my life, really, the fact that the president was assassinated. It was a really big deal. But anyway, while I was there at the radio school, the colonel that ran most of the post, he was the second in command of the whole post, this Colonel Gravell, he saw this boat, and this boat was behind the barracks, kind of in a nice little tucked away place. I had permission to keep it there. It was all changed up to a big post and to a big telephone pole. Anyway, the colonel had seen this boat. Well, at the same time, I'd gone down to Santee-cooper, which is a lake in South Carolina near Fort Jackson. And Santee is a big 165,000-acre monster expanse. And I started cutting my teeth and really learning some ABCs on my bass fishing because I'd grow up in Maryland. I had pretty good bass fishing there, but Santee was way, way good. And I'd gone down there the couple of weeks before the colonel saw my boat, and I'd caught this great big 11-pound bass, a great big giant trophy bass. In fact, I have it mounted somewhere around here. One of the first ones I ever had mounted, a big giant fish. Anyway, the colonel had seen it in the paper. The post, the Fort Jackson had a paper, and sure enough, there was a Private Martin holding this 11-pound bass. And he said, "Is that the guy? Is that boat belong to that guy that caught that big bass down Santee?" And whoever he was talking to, one of the sergeants said, yeah, that's the guy. He's in radio school. So he came into the classes, and we were doing Morse code, a bunch of stuff. And anyway, he said, I'd like to talk to you, Private Martin. And so, yes, sir. How you doing? He introduced himself. He said, "I wanted to talk to you about your fishing. You're going down to Santee and catching all these big bass," because in the article in the paper, I talked about catching other big bass too. And so he said, "Boy," he said, "you're really on top of some great fishing down there." He says, "I love to bass fish as well." I said, "Well, sir, I could take you fishing. That'd be a good deal." He said, "Really, could you?" He said, "That would be wonderful. If we could just, go fishing sometime." "Yeah, I can probably go this next weekend." So anyway, I took the colonel bass fishing down at Santee-cooper, and sure enough, he catches this big 8-pound bass. It's not the biggest bass of his life, but it's one of the biggest ones he'd ever caught. and he's just all excited. He says, "Oh, hey, Private Martin, thank you again. Here's, I don't know, he didn't exactly tip me. I can't remember what he did, but he said, here, whatever it was, he said, I'll make it up to you somehow." I don't know what it wasn't any kind of deal at that point. Anyway, he said, "Can we go again?" I said, "Absolutely, Colonel, we'll go again next week." So sure enough, we started going on a regular basis. I started taking the Colonel. But in the meantime, he gets out there on the boat and he's saying, "Hey, Private Martin, have you ever thought about becoming a career officer and making a career out of the military?" And I said, "No, sir. I mean, well, kind of." I said, "In school, we had mandatory ROTC, and I had 2 years of ROTC in college." And he said, "Oh, well, that would help." He says, "By the way," he says, "I'm in charge of the review board here at Fort Jackson. And all the candidates that want to come up and possibly get a chance to go to OCS, it's the Officer Candidate School that train at Fort Benning and Fort Sill and all these different Army bases. They have different Fort Jacksons Fort Benning's for infantry, and Fort Sill is for artillery, and there's so on like that. But anyway, Fort Campbell, Kentucky, I guess it's armor. I don't know." He says, "Are you interested in going to OCS?" Well, at the time I said, "I don't know. Okay, he kind of talks me into it." He says, "Come on in next week," and he said, "We'll do a review board." So I got in front of the review board, and there's the Colonel and all his other officers, and they're asking me questions about I don't know, my life and what I wanted to do and things like that. And sure enough, at the end of the thing, he said, "Hey, guess what? You're a perfect candidate. We're going to send you off to OCS." I said, "Oh, okay." Now he's kind of pushing me, but at the same time we're fishing every weekend, and so finally it gets time to go. And Fort Sill, I wanted to go to Fort Sill and become an artillery officer, but that didn't work out. So Benning came available, and the Colonel came in to me. He said, "Listen, Fort Benning's the #1 place for the infantry training. It's where all the big officers go for training. It's the biggest infantry training we have anywhere in the world, and it's world renowned. And we can send you to Fort Benning on training." Well, it's 220 men. He sent me there. Okay. Now I go down to Fort Benning. I'm in OCS, Officer Candidate School. That's a tough son of a gun, son. I mean, they're getting you up at the middle of the night for a formal, everybody dressed in formal thing, and we got a dead fly here. We got to have a ceremonial burial. It'd be 3 o'clock in the morning. Then we have to dig a hole. It has to be exactly 6 foot deep and 2 foot wide, and we have to dig this hole, and we have to have all these trumpets and musical instruments, and I don't know what all the thing we had. And we had to make a ceremony, and we had to march around and shoot the guns and all sorts of shit in the middle of the night just to bury a fly. That was silly stuff. It was silly stuff, but it was training. It was really funny. And so I thought it all was amusing. The other guys that failed, and all you had to do to get out of the thing, see, you didn't have to, it's a voluntary. And so all you had to do to get out of the whole program is say, "Hey, I don't want to do this anymore." Okay, you're out. You leave. But in the meantime, they're going to give you a real rough time. And they're gonna get you down and get you doing push-ups, and they're gonna march you in the middle of the night, and they're gonna just tire you out. They're gonna lock you up in like you're captured by a POW capture, and they're going to torture you. They're going to do all sorts of stuff. And all you have to say, any point, "Hey, I don't want to do this anymore." And they'll send you back to your regular job as a regular PFC. Okay, whatever position you came in at. But anyway, I thought it was all fun. I thought it was all fun and games, because it was fun and games. It was all keeping the good attitude. The drill sergeants would come in and they said, "Martin, get down on the floor. Candidate Martin, get down on the floor. Do this. You do these push-ups." I'd just laugh and have a big time and smile, and that's kind of good, because all that training was tough. And one thing I learned was endurance. I could go on with all the other 200 men, and they got to be 100 men, and they got to be about 50 men at the end. And it was a big march, and whoever could get there to the last, I'd be the last guy to ever fall down and stumble. I'd keep going no matter what. So I'm telling you, I really had good training. And I had a good physical body. I played a lot of sports in high school, and I played tennis in college, and I was a pretty good athlete. So I could handle it. So anyway, I got my commission. Boy, I'm now a second lieutenant, boy. And And the first thing I do is I get these orders to go to Vietnam. And you know, when you're 23 or 24 years old, you're invincible. You've had this training that they've taught you that you're now a leader of a military leader, and you can now take your men and just go right into battle and just nothing could bother you. And well, that's my mindset, was that nothing could bother me. I had all the training in the world, and nothing could bother me. So I was ready to go. Well, I get these orders from Colonel Gravell again, and he's sidetracked the orders going to Vietnam, and he gets me back at Fort Jackson. And I come into his office, and it's the first time I'm now a second lieutenant. And I come in to report to the colonel. I say, Colonel Gravell, Second Lieutenant Roland Martin, reporting for duty. And he said, hey, way to go, son. He said, congratulations. We shake hands. He said, let's go fishing and blah, blah, blah. Well, again, fishing was the whole key to this whole thing up to this point. All my times with the colonel had been, in a boat fishing. And all this really, the position I was in right then was because the fact that we fished all the time. Well, anyway, we also had a major, and this major ran these rifle ranges, and the colonel was over the major. And so the major major didn't like me much because I'd go fishing with the colonel, and he was kind of jealous of it because the major wanted to get more attention. And I was getting all the attention because the colonel would come and get me every Friday afternoon. He'd say, hey, Lieutenant Martin, let's go. We got things to do. We got to go fishing. So he'd go up to the major and say, hey, Major Smith, Lieutenant Martin and I, we got some things to do this afternoon. We'll be gone. Well, the major knew we were going fishing because we'd run off in the boat. He'd see us drive off or whatever. And he was mad. So he came up to me, the major came up to me and he says, Martin, he says, listen, he says, I don't appreciate all this special attention you're getting from the colonel. He says, it's not right. I have to cover for you every time you go off to go fishing. I got to find somebody else to replace you at the rifle range. Well, see, I ran a rifle range, and that's why I'm such a good long distance shooter. And I've taken up a little bit of bench rest shooting, and I've taken up all sorts of really neat stuff, varmint hunting, things like that, and of course deer hunting. So and I reload. I have reloading equipment upstairs, and I have all sorts of rifles. In fact, I'm going hunting next week. So that's all because of the fact that I was involved with military training and rifles and stuff, and I became an excellent shot. In fact, I set a record when I went through basic training at Fort Jackson. I tied the record, the all-time record that they had at train fire, the 112 shots. I had 111 out of 112 shots perfect. So that's the kind of shooting I could do. But I had the young eyes, I had 23-year-old eyes. Now, 50 years later, 60 years later, hey, they're not so young. And I can't see as well. I can't shoot like I used to be able to shoot. But anyway, it's still a lot of fun. The colonel was covering for me. And one day, I was late. I was kind of late coming into to my duty. See, also, as a second lieutenant and ran around a rifle range, I didn't have to report to duty at the rifle range till 8 o'clock. But they had me at 5 o'clock to get up, and I was an executive officer at one of the training companies, one of the basic training companies. So at 5 o'clock, I had to rouse those guys up and say, follow me up the hill, we're going to do Army exercises. Well, I was in real good shape. And they do an Army daily dozen that's, push-ups, sit-ups, calisthenics, and hop, straddle hops, and all those kind of things. And I would lead them in that. I would actually be the one to lead them. And I noticed this, out of every 220 men that's in a company, there's always a couple good college athletes and a couple really extremely healthy, fit people coming in, and then most of them aren't. But out of the 220 men, there'd always be 2 or 3 that would always be able to do what I could do. And I was fit. So I just run them until everybody would drop, and there wasn't anybody left doing push-ups or whatever we were doing until there were just 2 or 3, and they were these top guys, and I probably couldn't have beat them anyhow. They were probably in better shape than I was. But anyway, at 8 o'clock, I'd go to the rifle range, and then I'd requisition 40,000 rounds of ammunition. 40,000 rounds. Well, we'd shoot 220 men. We'd shoot almost 40,000 rounds a day, and my job was to lay there on the rifle range with my helmet liner, which is a steel kind of thing, and the receiver would be this way. I'd be looking at the guy's eyes, and he'd be shooting out this way, and the rifle would be coming right by my head, and I'd be looking at his eyes, and he could be looking past me down the sight, and I'd have my finger on the trigger, and I'd say, okay, Private, Well, you know, I'm going to pull the trigger. You just get it all lined up, okay? You get it all lined up. Just you breathing right, and I'd fire the round. Boom. Well, they issued these hearing aids. They weren't hearing aids. They were like a little rubber thing you stick in your ear. It ruined my ears. In fact, right now, these are my hearing aids. These are military issue. These are $7,000 hearing aids that I get from the VA, the Veterans Administration, because I'm on disability for my hearing. I shot all those millions of, well, I don't know if millions of rounds, but 40,000 rounds a day. And half the time without proper ear protection, I have a constant ring in my ears, and the hearing's way off, like 60% loss here and 50% loss here. Anyway, with the hearing aids, I do pretty good. I can turn them way up. And I get in the woods, I can hear turkeys and stuff, and I can hear deer walking in the leaves, but I get good hearing aids. That's the big part of it. So anyway, that's my military story. Hey, we'll see you again soon. Hey, listen, hit that likes button. It's so important to do that, and we'll see you again soon, and thanks for watching.